Forest rangers, what are your unexplainable and downright creepy stories? One of my best friends from college majored in geology and ended up becoming a park ranger in the southeast US. We haven't spoken in years, as often happens with time, but I remember about 8 or 9 years ago, he told me a story about an elderly married couple he had recently assisted. He had noticed them visiting the park several days in a row and learned they were from out west, revisiting the place where they had gotten engaged decades earlier. They were searching for the exact spot where he had proposed, a place they had photos of, but they were having trouble locating it. After looking at their pictures and getting a general idea of where they were trying to go, my friend escorted them in his park vehicle and then hiked with them to where he believed the location would be. They found it, and he left them there, returning to his station at the park entrance. He said he had a strange feeling once he got back, an instinct that he needed to wait and see them leave. However, when it was time for the park to close for the night, they still hadn't returned. He reported this, left his assistant to wait at the entrance station, and drove back to the location where he had left the couple. He found both of them lying down, spooning, along the riverbank. Neither was alive. He called the authorities, went through all the necessary procedures, and then went home. The police were able to identify them, but didn't have much other information initially. Later, my friend learned that the wife was terminally ill with cancer, and they had both committed suicide by ingesting a combination of chemicals and pills. They had simply chosen to do it at the place where their life together had begun with their engagement. My friend wasn't devastated by the news. He was obviously saddened by their deaths, but explained that he believed they hadn't asked for help finding the spot earlier because they didn't want anyone to think they had assisted in their suicide. I have a friend who works as a trail ranger, the kind of ranger who can't really get you into serious trouble. He told me about this one time he was out with another actual law enforcement ranger, gathering illegally placed wildlife cameras and knocking down hunting stands, feeders, and blinds. The other ranger wasn't feeling well and decided to head back early, as it was a solid hour's ATV ride back to the station. My friend finished up the last site when he suddenly heard voices. Keep in mind, he was way off any established trails. He called out, but no one answered. As darkness began to settle in, he started to make his way back, only to find that his ATV wouldn't start. He then noticed the battery cable wasn't connected anymore. He reattached it and tried to drive, but the ATV was moving incredibly slowly, barely going at all. Less than half a mile later, it completely died. He radioed back, basically saying, "Hey guys, I need someone to come pick me up." They replied that they would, but it would take about an hour. He asked if the other ranger had made it back, and they said no. He found a spot and started a small fire. Not long after, he heard voices again. It was dark, and he was definitely on edge. The voices now sounded like an argument. Someone was angry and yelling at someone else who sounded scared. He called out, asking if anyone needed help. The voices didn't seem to notice or care. He guessed they had to be less than 1,000 feet away. He radioed again, and they said they were having trouble figuring out which trail he might be on and hadn't left yet. He asked them to just get the other ranger to tell them his location since he had left with the iPad that had the map. They told him the other ranger still wasn't back. About 3 more minutes passed, and he heard the voices start up again. He decided to walk towards them, hoping maybe they were just some drunk idiots who might have a map. He walked in their direction, but the voices seemed to get further away as he got closer. Finally, after about 20 minutes, he gave up and walked back to his fire. He got a radio call. They said the other ranger had been found passed out and covered in vomit and was being taken to the hospital. However, he had marked off all the locations where they had taken down stands on the iPad, so they had a general idea of my friend's location. Then the radio went dead. Then the voices came back. Bored out of his mind, he decided to try and listen to what they were arguing about, picking up phrases like, "Well, it wasn't yours to take, I don't care, you knew better," and so on. He figured it was probably 2 hunters fighting over a kill. Then he heard one of them shout something he couldn't quite make out, followed by silence. Then, bang, a gunshot. He doused his fire and hid. After that, he heard nothing but his own breathing for the next half hour until he saw ATV lights approaching. He told the guy picking him up everything, and they radioed it in. They had people searching for 3 hours and found nothing. They came back the next day with police and dogs. After about an hour, they found a shallow grave. Inside was a long dead man, clearly shot in the face. The thing was, it was a skeleton that had been there for years. So, either the argument he heard last night just ended with a gunshot and both parties went home, or he somehow heard the murder of someone from years ago. I've been a ranger with the USFS for nearly 15 years, but this story takes place about 3 years into my career. We had been getting reports about a lone wolf with a collar hanging around the campsites. Strange, since wolves aren't typically found in this area. But you learn quickly in this job that anything is possible. Thankfully, none of the calls mentioned any aggressive behavior from the animal. I left the station around noon to check out the locations where it had been sighted. I spent about 3 hours wandering around. No new calls came in during that time, until I decided to take a water break. I sat down, had a snack, drank some water, and was getting ready to move on when I saw it, about 20 feet away, trotting near the tree. It seemed friendly and had the collar, so I whistled, and it came right over to me. Getting a closer look, I realized it wasn't a wolf. It was huge, but its build was wrong, and its fur was dark. Still, I could see why someone might mistake it from a distance. I radioed in, reporting that I had the dog with me, but as soon as I said I'd bring it in, the dog took off. It looked like it was playing, seeing how far it could get me to chase it, typical dog behavior. I went after it, and I swear it was a game of chase for at least 5 minutes as we ran steadily through the forest. Seriously, don't go running through the woods unless you know the area intimately. The dog finally slowed down near a rocky creek bed and started pacing around a specific spot. I approached cautiously and didn't see anything unusual at first. Then I noticed it. The overgrowth had almost completely hidden what appeared to be bones. I called it in immediately, and another team was dispatched to recover the remains. When I turned back to find the dog, it was just gone. Honestly, though, it wasn't my priority at that point. It had seemed friendly enough, and I figured we'd run into it again later. The bones were identified as belonging to a teenage male who had died from a self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head. He had been reported missing in the area long before I became a ranger, and there had been very little hope of finding him. I spoke to his mother on the phone. She called to thank me personally, and she asked how I'd found her son. I mentioned the black dog, then realized I might have said something wrong because there was a pause on her end of the line. After I gave a couple of details about the dog, she quietly explained that her son, who struggled with making connections, had fallen into a deep depression after the death of his best friend, the very dog that had led me to him. I think I spent the rest of the day in a daze. I'm still somewhat in disbelief, but I know what happened. Also, using a throwaway account, because my main would reveal the identity of the individual in this post and the location. The family is still grieving their son. I wasn't a park ranger, but I lived in a small cabin on the edge of a national park. The place was remote, about a 4-mile drive from the nearest road, with no plumbing or power. It felt like the middle of nowhere, especially since the property bordered the park itself. My roommate at the time was an intern with the Park Service, though he was definitely a city guy at heart. Every night, around the dead of night, I'd hear strange noises in the woods. At first, I thought it was someone walking, footsteps clear and deliberate. But then the sound would just stop in the thick, overgrown parts of the jungle. That's when you start questioning yourself. Is it an animal? A pig? A cat? Or just the wind? The cabin didn't have a proper locking door, and the owners didn't want me to install one. So I began sleeping in my car, parked over an acre away from the cabin, well away from where I heard the noises. But the footsteps didn't stop. They kept coming. Eventually, I couldn't take it anymore and moved out. My roommate, who thought I was losing my mind, stayed behind, still sleeping in that doorless cabin. It wasn't long before he got robbed. Not once, but twice. Finally, he put up motion trigger cameras. That's when we discovered the truth. A man with a long rifle would hike up to the property, hide in the bushes, and just watch us. I wasn't a ranger, but I was out camping with my dog one night along the Mogollon Rim in Arizona. It was dark, and we were sitting by the campfire when we heard something moving behind a bush close to our camp. Instead of my dog barking like he usually would, he started to whimper. I didn't think much of it at first, just tossed another log on the fire and kept an eye on things. A few minutes later, we heard more rustling, this time from a different bush. My dog, now clearly uneasy, got up and went over to the tent, scratching at the door like he wanted to go inside. Feeling a little on edge, I grabbed a couple of rocks and tossed them in the direction of the noise, but nothing happened. By now, I was pretty spooked. I threw a couple of big pieces of wood on the fire, hoping the extra light would keep whatever was out there at bay. I climbed into my tent with my dog, and we tried to sleep, hoping the night would pass without further incident. Thankfully, there were no more disturbances, and we eventually drifted off. The next morning, I went out to check behind the bushes where we'd heard the noises. To my surprise, I found mountain lion tracks, fresh ones, circling around our camp. I'm sure glad I didn't go snooping around at night when I first heard those sounds. I wasn't a ranger, but I used to be part of a group similar to the Scouts, so we spent a lot of time in the woods. Weird things would happen now and then, but most of the time they were easy to explain. There's one thing, though, that still scares the hell out of me to this day. I was a leader for a group of 8 to 10-year-olds, and we were out on a camping trip. It was the first time we'd stayed in that area, and it was huge. Normally, we'd scout the terrain ahead of time to make sure we were familiar with the lay of the land and to identify any dangerous spots we needed to avoid. But this time, it was impossible to fully explore. It was just too vast. Every camp has what we call a night game, which is usually a scary activity where the kids have to complete tasks while the leaders do their best to terrify them. Of course, we had one during this trip. We masked up as monsters and hid out in the woods near the checkpoints the kids needed to pass. While running between the checkpoints, I found an open stretch of forest with very little foliage, perfect for chasing after the kids. There wasn't much cover, just trees, so I couldn't use my flashlight or the kids would spot me from far away. It was dark, the kind of unsettling darkness that plays tricks on your mind and makes you start imagining things. During my time in the woods, I saw a shadow that looked about my size darting past me several times. I couldn't make it out clearly, so I figured I was just imagining things, especially since there was nothing when I turned my flashlight on. As the game neared its end, I saw the shadow again. This time, it was standing near a tree, not far from me. I thought it was just one of the other leaders trying to scare the kids, so I decided to check it out since it was about time to head back. I aimed my flashlight toward the tree, and as I got closer, I could see that there was indeed someone standing there. They were wearing what looked like a torn burlap sack, and their head was covered with a few white plastic bags that had been tied together. A feeling of pure dread washed over me. Something was very wrong. I asked if everything was okay, but they didn't respond. The only sound I could hear was a strange knocking noise like someone knocking on wood. I took a few more steps closer until I was about 10 meters away, and that's when I realized what the noise was. The person was banging their head repeatedly against the tree. It was a man, barefoot, with his arms and legs caked in dried mud. His hands were in a strange, cramped position. At this point, I figured it was just one of the other leaders pulling a prank, so I told him to knock it off. Then he slowly turned his head and started walking toward me. I don't know what it was, but something deep inside told me to run. Even if this was just a stupid prank, something about it didn't sit right, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was in danger. So I bolted, running as fast as I could. I could hear him running after me, but I was too scared to look back, afraid I'd run into a tree. I made it back to the campsite, and every single person who could have been dressed like that was already there. There was no way they could have gotten there before me, and if they had, they definitely didn't have time to change into their regular clothes. I told the others about the encounter, thinking they'd get a kick out of it, but they just stared at me, thinking I was trying to scare them. We left it at that. The next day, I decided to go back and check it out. Maybe some weirdo had taken a bad mushroom trip or something and was out there in danger. I brought someone along for safety, and we ventured back into the woods. There was nothing but endless trees until we arrived at the tree where I'd seen the person banging his head. And there, nailed to the tree, was a dead, skinned, decomposing rabbit. We called the cops, but they didn't seem too concerned. They did a quick sweep and brushed it off as a prank by another scouting group or some local kids, but they didn't find anything else. We didn't notice anything else unusual after that, so maybe it was just a sick joke, but still, some people have a seriously messed up sense of humor. There's a small chance I might be the cause of a story one ranger told about a decade ago. I was out hunting with my dad, several miles away from any trails deep in public land. The day went by slow, weather was miserable, and I wasn't hearing any distant gunshots, which usually means the deer aren't moving much. So, I decided to radio my dad to let him know I was heading back, and we made plans to meet up where we'd split up earlier that morning. About 20 minutes later, I was kneeling at the edge of a pond, peeling off my bulky camo layers. I was just sorting through my gear and putting stuff in my bag while listening to my earphones. I can't remember if I took off my blaze orange hat to pull off my pullover, but I had all the right gear to signal I was a hunter and I was being safe. As I was digging through my bag, I thought I heard someone faintly yelling, so I took one earbud out. That's when I noticed a lone forest ranger crouched across the pond, just watching me. I stood up, but didn't wave. I wasn't even sure he had yelled in the first place, so I didn't shout anything back. We just stared at each other for what felt like a few minutes. To be clear, we weren't doing anything illegal. I had unloaded my rifle by then, though it was still slung over my shoulder, hiding the fact the action was open, and I was following all the rules and regulations. I hunched back over my bag, grabbed my walkie-talkie, and radioed my dad. "We've got company." I wasn't trying to be suspicious. I just didn't want my dad to come stumbling down the hill and get caught off guard by a friendly law enforcement officer. While I looked back up, maybe 15 seconds later, that ranger was just gone. Like, completely gone. I figured he'd left, so I met up with my dad a little while later and started to tell him what happened. He just shrugged and said, "Yeah, with how deep we are in here, he probably thought we were up to no good and took off when he saw you on the radio." They get ambushed like that. It wasn't until that moment that it hit me, my nervousness around law enforcement might have caused anxiety for that ranger. I never considered that my presence could make someone feel uneasy. So if you're reading this, DNR bro, I just want to say my bad and keep up the great work. I was out in the Gila wilderness, along with a convoy of campers and fishermen, making the drive on the dirt road from Mogollon to Snow Lake when we spotted a forest ranger pulled over for checking out a ditch. Turns out, some idiot had tried to make a U-turn, not realizing that the loose rocks made it hard to stop. The vehicle went over the edge and got high-centered. We were miles away from the nearest official campground. It was early spring and the nights were still pretty cold. So we got a Jeep with a winch in position and started pulling the vehicle out of the ditch. That's when a guy in a purple velvet sweatsuit came down off a hill. A white dude, blonde, skinny, and wearing only that purple velvet sweatsuit, a walking stick, and a fanny pack. No joke, this guy was in a full-on pimp-style sweatsuit. We couldn't get over it. The ranger immediately got suspicious. He started asking the guy where he was staying and where he'd come from. It was about 9 a.m., and there was no way this guy could have hiked in from anywhere close unless he'd been walking for hours. The German guy, as it turned out, was just goofy and pointed toward the other mountain when asked where he was staying or going. We all thought it was kind of funny, but we also wondered how this guy was surviving without food or water, especially at that altitude, with the sun beating down, even if the temperature was only around 75 degrees. But the German guy refused any help. No water, no food. He just crossed the road and wandered off into the woods. The ranger told us he couldn't really stop him since the guy seemed fine, but he'd check a few campsites in that direction later to see if he made it. So we made our way to Snow Lake and got to the important business of drinking like fish to better catch fish. Later that evening, the ranger stopped by to tell us no one at any of the other camps had seen the guy. He'd radioed around, and no other rangers had found any abandoned camps or missing campers. They hadn't seen any sign of the German guy in the purple sweatsuit either. The next day, the ranger who had been on duty rolled off, and his replacement came by to make sure the other ranger wasn't just smoking something we gave him. We assured him that it all really happened. We never heard anything else about the German guy in the purple pimp sweatsuit, but it sure made for a good story. Update, I texted my buddy who was with me that day to reminisce about the German guy, and he reminded me that the purple pimp German looked a lot like Rhys Ifans, the actor who played Nigel the kicker in The Replacements, that Keanu Reeves football movie. The movie came out a few years after our camping trip, but we remember watching it and thinking, that's the crazy German we met. My friend also mentioned how absolutely happy that German guy seemed, just blissed out in his purple sweatsuit. Not a ranger myself, but my uncle was. He used to tell this one story from when he worked in Montana, way out in the middle of nowhere, about 5 to 10 miles from the nearest town, deep in the woods. One day, he was riding his ATV up a semi-big hill that overlooked a valley. There was a clearing between the trees that he could spot from a distance. Through his binoculars, he saw something strange. An older woman, probably in her 60s, dressed in black, standing in the middle of the clearing. Surrounding her were 6 to 8 wolves. Now, he was a pretty good distance away from her, but the sight of the woman and the wolves freaked him out, so he started yelling and honking his horn, trying to scare the wolves off. He tore down the hill as fast as he could, but by the time he reached the clearing, there was no one there. No woman. No wolves. Just a silver ring with a black stone in the middle, lying in the grass. He still has that ring to this day, and he's never been able to explain what happened. A friend and I were out camping on my land one weekend when we noticed something odd. There were some belongings from someone else at our campsite, and we could see someone walking around in our field. When we finally went to bed, we started hearing footsteps moving around our fire. It sounded like someone was adding wood to the fire, almost like they were trying to stay warm. I grabbed my shotgun and racked it, calling out that they'd better get off our property. The person ran off into the night. Over the next few weeks, we started noticing things missing. Small items at first, but then our chainsaw, which had been locked up in our tractor, disappeared. Since then, things have been quiet, thankfully. But that wasn't the only strange thing I've experienced in the woods. There's another story that still sends chills down my spine. One day, my friend and I were fishing on the river in a Little John boat. We were relaxing as the sun began to set, and the crickets started chirping. Then, out of nowhere, we heard a loud splash behind us toward the opposite bank. We turned to look, and just as we did, we saw something even stranger. A large rock, the size of a bowling ball, came flying down the riverbank and splashed into the water near us. It wasn't tumbling, it was thrown. We could hear rustling in the underbrush, but it was too dark to see anything clearly. We laughed it off at first, but then a few more rocks came flying toward us, each one landing closer than the last. After 5 or 6 rocks, one of them splashed just a little too close for comfort, and we decided it was time to call it a day. There's some seriously weird stuff out there in those woods. You never know what might be lurking just beyond the trees. My cousin works for the Forest Service in the Montana/Wyoming area, and I decided to join her on a trip to test the waters. She's a hydrologist, and part of her job involves heading out to remote areas to test streams and snow runoff to make sure there are no contaminants. I thought it would be cool to tag along, get a tour, and experience it for myself. We were going to be camping out for 2 nights, so we packed all our gear into saddlebags and saddle bundles and set off. The first day and night were incredible. The scenery was breathtaking, and the air was so fresh. It was so peaceful out there. Honestly, I love that area and wish I could visit more often. The second day, though, took a strange turn. My cousin asked me, "You want to see something weird?" Naturally, I said yes, and she led me off the main trail on a side journey into a tiny ravine. We ended up straying about 2 hours off our planned route. At the end of this little fold in the land, she dismounted and told me to do the same. We tied the horses up in this beautiful little clearing, and she handed me a tiny wildlife path to follow. Along with it, she gave me a little rechargeable radio. It could be plugged in or wound up, and it also worked as a lantern, though that drained the batteries quickly, so I only used it when necessary. So I followed the path, and out in the middle of nowhere, I came across something bizarre. A huge coil of wire sticking out of the ground. It wasn't anything massive like a power line, but a regular 10 or 12 gauge house wire. It trailed off into the brush and trees, so naturally my curiosity got the best of me, and I started following it. My cousin followed behind me as we walked, and as we continued, the wire went up from the ground, stretched across the limbs of trees, and then down again, snaking around rocks. It finally deadened it into an outlet, an actual outlet, mounted on the side of an old schoolteacher's desk. It had a metal base, and the top looked like a cheap wood/plastic thing from the 80s. There was no chair, no building, nothing around it, just this random desk with an outlet in the middle of the forest. I was standing there completely confused when my cousin took the radio, pulled out its cord, and plugged it into the outlet. Then, the radio lit up and started blasting static. The wire was live, and there we were in the middle of nowhere. No road access, no buildings for miles, and no other people around. And yet, somehow, there was power running to this random desk. It was bizarre as hell. No creepy jump scares, no bodies, just one solitary desk, powered and sitting in the woods. I wish I'd thought to take a picture of it. It's one of those things I'll never be able to explain. I'm probably a little late to the party with this one, but I worked for a few months as a park ranger with the Florida Forest Service at my local state forest. The creepiest thing I encountered, though, was something pretty heavy. During my second week on the job, I found the body of a young man who had hung himself. The truly unexplainable stuff, though, was a lot stranger. We'd often find children's clothes folded neatly and left along the trails, pairs of shoes just sitting in the middle of dense burned blocks, and a general sense of unease that would settle in the air. In my first few weeks, I'll admit I was easily spooked by these things, but after spending hours alone in the woods day after day, it took a lot to really get under my skin. One thing I learned, though, when the forest goes completely silent, it's time to pack up and get moving. You don't stick around when everything goes still. Not a ranger, but like most of the other stories here, I was camping in the woods. It was a backwoods campground, and the nearest sign of civilization was a National Guard depot about 5 miles away. This was the week before Labor Day, and the place was completely empty. We were half asleep in our tent when we started hearing what sounded like a little girl laughing in the distance. It went on for about an hour, echoing through the woods. Needless to say, we didn't get much sleep that night. I'm a ranger at a fairly remote desert park, though I'm not a law enforcement officer. This incident happened before I started working here, but the other rangers I work with were there at the time. They were doing a routine patrol during the summer, which is our off-season, at one of our campgrounds that isn't used very often. During the patrol, the maintenance ranger found a completely burnt-out car in one of the campsites. The desert can be a strange place, so he simply called the sheriff's department and waited. The sheriff arrived and discovered that there was a body in the driver's seat. It was just a torso and a head with no arms or legs, and it was badly burned. The sheriffs on the scene just marked it down as a suicide and had the vehicle removed. We're located close to the border with Mexico, and we see a lot of illegal drug trafficking. So, I guess they don't even bother trying to solve those kinds of cases. It's super sketchy to think about. Not exactly a ranger story, but here's one from the woods. It was late spring, and after a heavy rain had flooded the dike and the public hunting grounds, my buddy and I decided to go fishing in the shallows. We didn't catch anything, but we had a good time. As it started to get dark, we made a fire to warm up and dry off before heading back. As the last light of day slipped away, we heard something that sent chills down our spines. It was a scream, one of those blood-curdling sounds that could have come from a terrified little girl. At first, we thought it was just frogs, so we shrugged it off and kept talking. But then we heard again, much closer, maybe 30 feet away at the tree line. That was enough for us to bail. We bolted out of there, laughing nervously once we got back home. Fast forward 6 years. I'm on lunch break, telling this story to my lead. He pulls up a YouTube video and plays me a sound. It was the exact same scream. He hands me the phone, and I see a mountain lion on the screen. That terrifying scream? It was a mountain lion's warning call. I was the only recreation ranger in a small district in southern Idaho, and the nearest town was about 1.5 hours away by car from my guard station. When I first moved into the station, nothing was quite right. The solar power wasn't working, and I hadn't slept properly in about a month. Between bats in the cabin and strange sounds outside, something heavy moving on the deck at night, it was hard to get any rest. The woods there felt off, eerie, in a way I wasn't used to. I was familiar with the southwest Ponderosa forests, but these woods had a different, unsettling vibe. About 2 months into the seasonal job, I started hearing what sounded like something walking and scratching on the deck at night, sometimes even at the door. This area was known for its badgers and beavers, so I didn't think much of it first. Still, every time I left the cabin at night, there was this nagging feeling that I was being watched. One night, after a grocery run, which I always did on Tuesday nights, I felt an uneasy sense in the pit of my stomach. And of course, I wasn't carrying my shotgun at the time. I got out of the vehicle and looked to my right, about 50 feet from the front door. That's when I saw them, 2 eyes about 3.5 to 4 feet off the ground. To say I freaked out would be an understatement. I started shouting, "Get out of here," but the eyes just crouched lower, then slowly moved closer. It was clearly a large animal of some kind, and definitely not a coyote. In a panic, I grabbed a piece of firewood and tossed it in the creature's direction. It leapt back, but didn't make a sound. I threw 4 or 5 more pieces, and still, it crept closer. By now, I was fumbling with my keys, cursing under my breath, but of course, the solar power was down again. I finally managed to get inside, grab my shotgun, even though it's technically against the rules to have guns in government housing. Who lives in the backcountry without a gun, though? And headed back outside. By the time I got out, the creature was a little closer, but my lousy headlamp wasn't helping much. I loaded the shotgun, still tossing firewood with one hand, trying to make myself seem bigger. Finally, the thing turned and slinked back into the brush. That night, I downed about 4 IPAs and slept with my shotgun by my side. In the morning, the trail crew came up and we found mountain lion tracks all over the porch, the rocking bench, and the compound. They led all the way back to the creek. After that, I kept hearing the rocking chair moving and footsteps on the porch, but I never found any tracks again. Considering how muddy it always was up there, it was strange that no tracks appeared after that night. I've been stalked by mountain lions before, but I'd never felt that unsettling presence in the woods like I did there. There was something different about that place. My cousin, a park ranger, told me this story. A woman had gone missing in the forest. It wasn't immediately alarming, as it's a large area, and the initial plan was just to drive around until they found her. However, after 4 hours of searching without success, he heard a blood-curdling scream. Another person had located the missing woman, but her throat was slit so deeply that my cousin wasn't even sure if what she had could still be called a throat. He restrained the man who found her and called the police. Sadly, neither he nor I could find any news reports or further information about this incident, and my cousin didn't follow up after the arrest. So, for all I know, the man who found her might have had nothing to do with it. In 2016, my boyfriend, now my husband, and I went on a camping trip in eastern Pennsylvania. We chose a primitive campsite for the night, free, with no cell service, barely a road leading to it, the works. We did encounter 2 other people that day. They might not be relevant to what happened later, but they gave us a creepy vibe, so I'll describe them. The first was a woman whose truck was pulled off to the side of the road as we drove by. Her hood was up, and she seemed to be waiting for someone to stop and help. Usually my boyfriend is the first to offer assistance, but this time he said something about her just fell off. She didn't really seem like she genuinely needed help, and usually people who do look at you with hope as you approach. She just seemed to expect us to stop. That was his take on it, anyway. I hadn't really noticed anything particularly strange about her. The next person we encountered was after we had chosen our campsite and were setting up a fire for hot dogs. I had noticed a car drive by a few times, but my boyfriend pointed out that it was the same car each time, and the man inside watched us intently every time he passed. My boyfriend was a bit uneasy about this, but we had driven around for a while before finding a spot we liked. It had been raining, everything was muddy, and we wanted the driest site possible. He could have been doing the same thing, just looking for a good spot. We briefly considered moving, but the road was muddy too. If he wanted to find us, all he had to do was follow our tire tracks. There were a few other tracks, but not many. He'd only have to backtrack a little to locate us again. He didn't drive by again, so we stayed and spent the remaining hours before dark goofing off. No one else came by. Whether or not those 2 were connected to our later experience, the real fear came in the middle of the night. We had fallen asleep in our tent when, around 3 a.m., we were jolted awake by this incredibly loud noise. I can't describe it very well, or even remember exactly what it sounded like, but my boyfriend said it reminded him of a chain gun revving up. Another way he described it was like someone had recorded a shovel being dragged over gravel and was playing it through a loudspeaker. He jumped up and peered out the small window of the tent, but couldn't really see anything. The sound repeated itself a few more times. I was too scared to speak, so my boyfriend whispered that it was probably miles away and I should go back to sleep. I didn't question this, as I figured loud sounds could easily travel long distances. After we left, he admitted that it sounded like it had actually been coming from just down the road, but he didn't want to scare me. Looking back, I probably should have wondered why he would bother to whisper if the sound was supposedly far off. I was still terrified. Every little sound I heard outside sounded like someone was walking around the tent. We lay there for a while longer when finally my boyfriend told me to get dressed because we were leaving. This alarmed me, and I became even more alarmed when he unwrapped the machete we had bought specifically for this trip from its plastic sheath before opening the tent. We quickly packed up our things and loaded the car. I looked around for footprints that weren't ours, but despite the moonlight providing decent light, I couldn't really see any clearly. I did point out something my boyfriend hadn't noticed before we got into the car, though. There was a beer can by our dead fire that definitely hadn't been there before. We hadn't even brought any beer. While we were driving away, my boyfriend explained that he was nervous someone might have been trying to lure us out of the tent, so he didn't think it was a good idea to run out immediately. He also half expected to find our gas tank had been siphoned, but that wouldn't have stopped us since we had a hybrid car. We joked, nervously, that would make a funny hybrid commercial. Number of brutal murders avoided by driving a hybrid. 2. We only joked because we were both absolutely terrified and full of adrenaline even then. For the rest of our trip, we only stayed in well-populated campgrounds or got a hotel. Not a ranger, but back in 2010, fresh off a wilderness leadership course, I decided to head to Colorado for some solo time in the wild. I'd heard about some hot springs near the Colorado River that were only accessible during the winter months. The summer snowmelt would submerge them, and planned to spend a few weeks there. It was on BLM land, and my campsite was about a 4-mile hike from where I parked my car. The BLM ranger who oversaw the area saw me arrive and just asked that I write the date on my windshield each week to let her know I was still alive out there. Anyway, the experience was mostly peaceful, but every night I was gripped by a primal fear of bears. They should have been hibernating, but if they weren't, it meant they were desperately hungry, and I was essentially dinner. Because of this constant worry, I decided to set up camp close to a cliff. It was about a 40-foot drop down to the river, and my logic was that in a worst-case scenario, I could jump and then get to the hot springs to avoid hypothermia. It was a crazy plan, but once you're out in the wilderness, you realize bear spray is pretty useless inside a tent. So, one early morning, I woke up to these incredibly loud animal noises outside my tent. They were getting closer, very loud, accompanied by heavy grunting and breathing. I was too terrified to open the tent. I just froze solid, and the footsteps kept getting closer and closer and closer. At this point, I could hear it sniffing my tent. I didn't dare move. I just lay there, paralyzed with fear. The sound started to move away from my tent, but whatever it was still out there, and now I could hear more than one animal. I finally mustered the courage to cautiously poke my head out of the tent, and it was a herd of elk. I swear, though, in that moment, it was probably the most scared I've ever been while camping. As an ex-ranger, let me tell you about a time we had a group of rowdy frat boys camping near us. The noise was unbearable. We stopped by twice to remind them to keep it down, and on the second visit, I made it clear, this is your last warning. Not only are you disturbing other campers, but you're also putting yourselves at risk. The local mountain lions are drawn to loud sounds at night, and these creatures, known as ghost cats, can approach without making a sound. If you hear anything, stay in your tents. Don't make a noise. Afterward, we headed back to the station, grabbed the mountain lion pelt from the interpretive center, and got our hands on the night vision goggles. The head ranger had spent most of the budget on supplies last year, so we had to make do. Once the frat boys were tucked away in their tents, we snuck back to their campsite. We laid down fake lion tracks everywhere, set up the pelt propped on sticks, and prepped the PA system. My partner Jim started making lion calls from a distance, getting closer with each one. I pulled the Jeep up like we were just arriving on the scene, turned on my mag light, and aimed it right at the lion pelt. Because I was moving fast, the shadow of the pelt appeared to move, making it look like a real lion. By this point, the frat boys were starting to panic. Jim shouted, "Stay in your tents," then yelled, "She's circling us," followed by, "There's another one." Finally, he screamed, "We've got to get out of here." We quickly turned off the flashlights, grabbed the lion pelt, jumped in the Jeep, and sped off into the night. The next morning, right after sunrise, the boys started cautiously peeking out of their tents, but no one was brave enough to venture out until around 8:30 a.m. When they finally saw the massive paw and claw prints scattered around, they completely lost it. Another successful use of your tax dollars at work. I'm not a ranger, but I have an odd camping experience that still baffles me. I've tried to figure it out, but after asking around, I've never found a satisfying explanation. It was on the West Coast at a campground where I went to sleep in my car due to back problems. I converted the back seat into a bench and laid down my sleeping bag, covering the windows for privacy. One morning, I woke up to a loud, rumbling noise. It was enough to stir me from sleep. Growing up in the suburbs, the sound reminded me of a shopping cart being pushed across a rough, gravel-filled parking lot. One of those places where the gravel sticks out between the cracks in the concrete. Then, out of nowhere, the car got bumped hard. The entire vehicle shifted. I quickly started unzipping my sleeping bag, using the inside zipper, but it wasn't the fastest process. By the time I finally managed to sit up and look around, there was nothing in sight. But something big had walked by, and I've always wondered what kind of animal makes a rumbling noise like that. During my time in the Scouts, the local equivalent, anyway, legally adult members had to complete the 3-feather challenge. This involved a day without food, a day of silence, and a day and night spent alone in the woods with only a knife and a tarp, unseen by any other person. Afterward, the final task was to sneak back into scout camp, undetected by the sentries, and report to the campmaster. It was my 3rd day, the solo wilderness portion. I set off, hiking for miles deep into the woods, finally finding the most isolated spot in the wildest, most overgrown area I could. I spent a spooky but uneventful night. Just before dawn, I decided to take a morning swim in the lake before starting my trek back to camp. I stripped off my clothes and headed towards the water, but I noticed a group of guys fishing. Deciding to avoid being seen, I turned back towards my makeshift camp. Suddenly, the ground beneath my feet gave way. I plunged downwards, finding myself submerged up to my armpits in the most revolting, foul-smelling mass imaginable. It was a pit where poachers had dumped the guts and leftovers of illegally hunted deer, left to fester for weeks. Picture the scene. A group of anglers hear some unearthly screaming coming from the direction of the woods. They rush towards the sound to see if someone needs help. What they encounter is a teenager-shaped figure, a veritable ghoul, completely covered in blood and putrid offal. This creature is crawling out of a bloody hole in the ground, shrieking and weeping, and then it runs straight towards them, desperate to reach the lake and wash off the horrifying filth. Alright, so this isn't exactly a ranger story, but here it goes anyway. I was camping deep in the forests of Jersey with a group of friends. We set up camp, chatting away in our tents, with the campfires still crackling in the background. It was a perfect night for telling scary stories, so that's what we did. Things were going smoothly until we heard some rustling in a nearby bush. Classic horror story setup, right? We all assumed it was one of our friends who had wandered off for a bathroom break. But as the rustling continued, we noticed something that made our blood run cold, the shadowy outline of a person circling our tent. We called out, thinking it was our friend, but there was no response. The figure stopped moving, frozen in place. At that point, we were starting to freak out. The figure outside clearly wasn't one of us, way too tall. One of our group members panicked, lied, and shouted that we were armed and would shoot if necessary. A long, tense minute passed in silence before we heard the most piercing, shrill scream we've ever heard. So loud it still gives me chills. Then, just like that, the figure vanished into the woods. Here's the strangest part. Our friend who had been at the restroom said he heard the same scream, but when he came back, there was no sign of anyone nearby. No footprints, no sign of a struggle, nothing. And we were deep in the woods, far from any easy trail or path, so it's not like some random person would have just stumbled across our camp. We never figured out who or what that was, but it definitely left us all a little spooked. Back in the 70s, my grandpa had a hunting buddy who was more of a recluse, basically a hermit, living out in the woods of the Pacific Northwest. On one of their hunting trips, my grandpa stayed at his buddy's cabin deep in the Cascade Mountains. The place was remote, no running water, no electricity, miles from a nearest town or paved road. The cabin was perched on stilts on a steep incline, with a 10-foot balcony jutting out from the bottom, but there were no stairs or ladder to get up to it. My grandpa always said he'd known this man for years, and he had no doubt about his honesty. He wasn't the type to make things up. I've known my grandpa for a long time, and I can tell you he's not someone who buys into nonsense either. One night, after a long day of hunting, they were relaxing at the cabin when the buddy casually mentioned that Sasquatch was in the area and warned him to be careful if he went out at night. My grandpa, thinking it was just a joke, chuckled and didn't give it much thought. But then his friend got serious. He grabbed some fruit, bread, and jerky, put them in a bowl, and took it outside to the balcony. Setting the bowl on the edge, he said, "It'll be empty by morning," and went to bed. The cabin was tiny, only about 300 square feet, an open floor plan with just one room. My grandpa had a cot set up near the window that looked out onto the balcony. In the middle of the night, he woke up to the sound of rustling outside. Peeking through the window, he saw the bowl, empty. And then, to this day, he swears he saw 4 fingers resting on the edge of the balcony, just before they let go of it. After that night, my grandpa never went hunting in that part of the mountains again. I've got a deep woods story that's been passed down through my family for years. My great uncle was the type who really thrived in the wilderness. It's a bit strange, but he'd rarely use a tent. He'd just sleep right on the ground in his sleeping bag. Since we're from Maine, there aren't too many large predators that pose a real threat to people. Sure, there are black bears, but they tend to avoid humans, so I guess my great uncle never really felt the need to worry. One night, he's out there sleeping in the woods when he wakes up to the sensation of tiny hands gently patting his face. Confused, he opens his eyes, and there's a raccoon standing over him, just feeling around his face. So what does my great uncle do? Without skipping a beat, he just closes his eyes and goes back to sleep. About 5 years ago, my dad had a conversation with a Chinese woman who had lived up in the mountains of Canada for around 30 years. She worked as an unofficial forest surveyor, someone the government would occasionally call upon when they were looking for forest fires or anything illegal going on in the area. According to her, she'd spotted multiple Sasquatch over the years. She said they were surprisingly intelligent, but just didn't want to interact with people. No interest, not even from the younger ones. However, because she had grown up in the area and had seen them since she was a child, they were pretty chill around her. She didn't seem the least bit shaken when talking about it, and my dad said she had one of the most rational, no-nonsense attitudes he'd encountered. At the time, my dad owned a gold claim in the area, and the woman advised him to leave it alone. She told him disturbing the land might upset things. She wasn't sure exactly what, but she said it wasn't a good idea. My dad was skeptical at first, but everything changed when, one day, he swears he saw one himself. He was standing there, just staring at this massive figure, when she appeared beside him, looked at it, and said, "That's the female one." Then, without a word, she went inside and left him out there, alone, while whatever was on the mountain just stood there. I remember reading a story on here not long ago that really gave me the chills. A guy had gone up to his dad's cabin after his father passed away. While he was there, he kept hearing what sounded like footsteps on the roof. He figured it was probably just an animal, nothing to worry about. But one night, while he was outside on the balcony smoking, He looked up and saw something that made his blood run cold. In the distance, perched in a tree, was what looked like a man. The figure was holding onto the branch above him, just staring down at him. He was too far away to make out any details, but the sight was unsettling enough. Back in the fall of 2017, I shot a deer right around dusk about 5 miles from my truck. I did my thing, got my gear off, grabbed my cart, and headed out. I reached the deer, gutted it quickly, and started hauling it back. About 2 miles in, though, my deer cart broke. It will snap clean off. I had no choice but to sling the deer on my back. That's when I started hearing coyotes, probably 3 or 4, faintly from the gut pile. I kept going another mile or so before I stopped to take a break. I was just sitting there listening to the coyotes when it hit me like a punch to the gut. Their yips were much louder now, and there were way more of them than before. They were within a quarter mile. And here I am, sitting there with no weapon but a hatchet and a gut knife, right next to the second course of their feast. Now, the first 3 miles were pretty easy, dry, with just a few thick spots. But the last 2 miles? Swampy as hell, thick as a jungle. I got moving, zigzagging through the swamp, running purely on adrenaline. I couldn't afford to look back as I could feel the dozen or so coyotes closing in, about 100 feet away. I didn't stop once, never dared to look back. When I hit the home stretch, I had to jump a 5-foot gate with the deer still on my back. No problem, except I collapsed on the other side, almost passing out from the exhaustion. That's when I heard the coyotes hit the fence behind me, just seconds after I made it over. They howled, snarled, and screamed from the other side. I was clutching my knife, ready to meet whatever came next. And just as suddenly as they appeared, they vanished. The woods went silent, and I limped the rest of the way back to my truck, grabbed the deer, and left. I called my dad, told him the story, and mentioned I was exhausted and would nap in the parking lot. I was covered in blood, scratched up, and bruised from branches slapping my face. I ended up falling asleep in the truck, and I woke up to tap on my window, followed by a bright light. I don't know who was more startled, me or the greenhorn DNR officer standing there, wide-eyed and slack-jawed, staring at me like I was some kind of monster. I told him the whole story. He checked my info. We had a good laugh, and I went on my way. Now, for anyone wondering why I didn't just drop the deer and let the coyotes have it, honestly, I don't know. It was only a 5-point buck, nothing huge, just a fairly average deer. I guess I'm just stubborn like that and didn't think it through. But hey, the deer tasted great. As for that DNR officer, I've seen him 3 times since then, each time ice fishing. He calls me Wild Man and doesn't even check my info or my fish anymore. We chat for a while when we run into each other. I consider him a friend at this point. Bonus, about a week later, I shot another deer from the same spot. While I was tracking it, I heard coyotes again, this time about 100 feet ahead of me. I had a pistol with me, so I unloaded a clip into the dirt to chase them off. They slinked off behind me, still making the occasional yip, but this time I responded with another round in the ground. I'm a little late to the party, but this is a fun one. I live in an urban area now, but I grew up surrounded by woods. One day, I took an Uber to a local land preserve to go for a hike. I had a good 20-minute chat with the driver on the way there, and during the conversation, he starts swearing up and down that he saw a flying dinosaur in the park. Naturally, I'm amused and ask him to elaborate. He tells me that while he was walking through the park, he saw this massive black shape fly up into a tree. He swears it wasn't a hawk or a crow. He's convinced it was a dinosaur. I start laughing and tell him he must have encountered the rare dino turkey. He goes silent for a moment, then suddenly blurts out, "God damn it. My buddies are never gonna let me live this down. It totally was a turkey. I didn't know those mofos could fly." Not a ranger, I know. Surprise, surprise. One summer, my boyfriend and I decided to drive all over California, sleeping in the back of his truck. One day, We ended up at the Emerald Pools near Lake Tahoe and decided to crash at a nearby public campground. There was only one other person there, along with the campground host. In the middle of the night, I suddenly woke up with a strange, unsettling feeling. I sat up and immediately noticed that the passenger door of the truck was wide open. The truck had a camper shell, and we always made sure to lock ourselves inside at night. You had to unlock the door from the inside to get out. I'm what my boyfriend calls a nervous Nelly, and I'm always double checking that the doors are locked before we sleep. So you can imagine how freaked out I was when I saw the door open. I was so rattled for the rest of the night, I could barely sleep. I used to spend a lot of time in the small forest near my neighborhood. Really just a strip of trees, with its biggest resident being a fox. About a year ago, I got into vulture culture and taxidermy. I've always been fascinated by zoology, and learning to look at animals from a different perspective has been incredibly interesting. At the time I was getting into this, the fox had just had kits and was hunting nonstop to feed them. So, I started a little exchange. I'd collect bones and other remnants from around the den, and if I came across any fresh animal corpses elsewhere, I'd leave the meat near the den instead of letting it go to waste. Unfortunately, this earned me the nickname of the outcast, or the creepy dead animal lady, from most of the kids who liked to play in the forest and saw me lugging around bags of rotting animal parts. As far as I know, none of them really knew anything about me beyond the rotting meat and the time I accidentally crashed through the trees carrying a bunch of live snakes. That definitely solidified their opinion of me. I'm not a ranger, but I worked in conservation. One day, I was walking along a creek bed that had a lot of loose rocks scattered in it. I'd been through this area plenty of times before and had seen lots of artifacts like arrowheads around the site. But on this particular day, something made me stop in my tracks. I turned around and, for some reason, started brushing aside some rocks under the water. That's when I found it, an unusual looking tool, about 1/2 inch wide and 5 inches long, with the tip broken off. It was buried under the loose river pebbles. The moment I saw it, I got goosebumps. I started scanning the area, feeling this overwhelming sense of unease. I was the only one out there on this 16,000-acre tract, but something about that moment made me feel like I was being guided to that exact spot. I'm not a ranger, but I was camping in a remote park in Argentina. There was only one other group in the campground, and I made some brief small talk with them, though I'm not fluent in Spanish, so it was a bit awkward. In the middle of the night, I woke up to what I swear was someone walking by my tent and shining a flashlight in. I've never experienced claustrophobia before, but in that moment I was panicking. I was in a mummy sleeping bag because it was freezing and I nearly tore the thing apart trying to get out. I thought someone was trying to get into my tent. Then, another time, I was winter camping in Minnesota with my dog, waiting for my friends to catch up. They were a few hours away. The campsite was a couple miles from the highway, and I was napping with my doggo inside the tent when an ambulance drove by at around 8 p.m. Right after it passed, a pack of coyotes started howling in the distance. That was the moment I made sure Doggo was securely on her leash before I'd let her roam around in remote campsites at night, but not anymore after that. I work at a summer camp where we take kids on canoe trips for a few days in national parks. One night, after setting up camp and putting out the fire, I was doing a final check of the site. I glanced at the lake and saw a man paddling a canoe by himself. It struck me as a bit strange, but not totally out of the ordinary, though it was odd that he was alone. He waved, so being the polite Canadian I am, I waved back. I went to bed in the staff tent, and everything seemed normal. I had a bit of trouble sleeping that night, so I decided to step outside for some stargazing, something that usually helped calm me down. As I left the tent, I was shocked to see the same man, now on our campsite, rummaging through our tarps and bags. I don't know what he was looking for, maybe food or something else, but it didn't matter. He was too close to the campers I was responsible for. We locked eyes and this guy stood up. He was towering over me. I'm pretty short, and in that moment I grabbed the first thing I could think of, a can of bear mace. This stuff is designed to stop a charging bear, so I held it out, ready to spray, and told him to get the hell off my campsite. He barely spoke, just stammered something like, "Oh, I didn't see you guys," as he started to leave. I immediately woke up the other staff members to make sure he was gone for good. We used our satellite phone to call the park rangers, giving them our location, a description of the man, and the details of what happened. Without a doubt, that was the scariest moment I've had on the job. I've learned not to fear animals. For the most part, they're predictable and not malicious. But people are the scariest and most dangerous thing you can encounter out in the wilderness. I'm not a ranger, but I'm definitely an avid camper. We were camping along the Sunshine Coast in the lower mainland of British Columbia. It was the off-season, so the area was pretty quiet with very few campers. We found a beautiful spot surrounded by lush, jungle-like forest and right beside the ocean. It was around 5 a.m., just before dawn, and we were camped by ourselves with no other tents nearby. Suddenly, I heard it, loud and clear right behind our tent. Ho-ee-dee, ho-ee. I woke up instantly and asked my husband if he heard it too, wondering what it could be. He looked at me and said, "Do you want me to be honest with you?" Yes. I think it was a Sasquatch. I laughed, thinking no way. There's just no way. But then I started thinking about the animals in the area and the different calls I'd heard. I'm an avid camper and live in the country, so I know the sounds of various animals. Cougar? Bear? No, that wasn't it. Owl? Nope. I couldn't sleep after that and kept the knife in my hand for a solid hour, just lying there, Googling Sasquatch sounds on my phone. I know there's a lot of conspiracy around this stuff, but we did find a recording of what was supposedly a Sasquatch call, and it sounded eerily similar to what we heard. I can't find a recording now, but I'll keep searching. Later that day, we went into town and told a local about it. He casually said, "Yeah, there are a lot of sightings around here. The natives even have totems dedicated to them." Well, shit. I'm not a ranger, but last year I went camping in early spring with some friends at a pretty remote spot, Wadagans National Park. There weren't many other campers around, and the area was beautiful and peaceful. 2 days into the trip, one of my friend's camp chairs broke, so we searched through all our stuff to find some cable ties to fix it. We checked our tents, the cars, and our bags, but couldn't find any. So we just left it for the time being. That night, I woke up to the tent shaking slightly. I nudged my boyfriend next to me, and we opened the tent. To our surprise, it was one of our friends standing outside in a panic. He was gasping for air, saying he couldn't breathe and that something was choking him. We immediately shone a torch on his neck, and that's when we saw it, 2 black cable ties tightly wrapped around his throat. They were so tight that they were cutting off his airway. We managed to cut the ties off, and after the immediate shock wore off, we went back to sleep, though, honestly, we didn't sleep well at all after that. The next morning, we asked him about it, if anything in his tent seemed off or if he noticed anything strange. He told us that when he woke up during the night, his tent was open. I'm not a ranger, but I did live near a national forest when I was in high school. One day, I asked my mom to drive me out to the woods so I could take some photos for a photography assignment. She stayed in the car, and I set off down the trail, telling her I wouldn't be long. The trail is actually really beautiful, leading down to a river where you can walk along the edge as it curves around a bend. But as I walked, something changed. I suddenly felt like I was in danger, like I was being watched. I was wearing an orange raincoat, so I was clearly visible, and I didn't have my glasses on. But as I looked across the river, To the other side of the bank, I saw something tall and gray moving through the trees, heading towards the water. I've never been so terrified in my life. I immediately went into full survival mode and ran back up the trail to my mom's car, telling her what happened as soon as I got there. It's still one of the freakiest experiences I've ever had. I wish I'd gotten a photo, but at the time I was a 16-year-old, 90-pound girl who was freaked out beyond belief. We were camping near the Dover Lights in Arkansas. It wasn't the most luxurious spot, but we found a guy who spent most of his time out there, legally of course, working remotely and making good money. He basically spent half the year vacationing in the woods. He offered to let my friend watch over his place while he visited his son. My friend, of course, immediately invited me and a few others to come hang out for a few days. So we spent our time drinking, smoking, fishing, and goofing off. Everything was fine until my female friend got incredibly drunk one night. She stumbled outside, completely naked, and started eating beans out of a cold pot. As someone who appreciates a little cleanliness, I followed her out to make sure she didn't hurt herself, while everyone else just laughed. There she was covered in beans, and I was trying to convince her to calm down and clean herself off with a towel when suddenly she froze. Her head whipped up like she was a deer sensing danger, and she just stared at the trees around us, complete darkness. Then out of nowhere she growled. Not like a joke, but a full-on guttural growl before sprinting into the woods. I had no idea what to do. She was completely out of sight, naked and alone in the pitch black. I tried calling out to her, but it was pointless. Then, in my panic, I made the dumbest decision possible. I followed her. I didn't get far. After about 5 meters into the dark, I noticed a faint light on the ground. When I picked it up, I realized it was a phone open to the camera app. The photos were of us, recent ones, some taken through the camper window, and one of my friend running directly toward the camera. They were all in creepy night vision mode. I freaked out, deleted the pictures, and then dropped the phone on a rock, stomping on it until the screen shattered. Still completely freaked out, I rushed back to the camper, calling out for her, but I couldn't find her. When I got back, I was relieved but still terrified to find her sitting in a lawn chair, very drunk and still naked. I managed to carry her back inside, where her boyfriend helped towel her off. They both passed out on the bottom bunk, spooning. I never told them what really happened, and she didn't remember a thing the next morning. But I locked the door and stayed up, waking up every hour to keep an eye on things. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was really off. Not a ranger, but a dedicated mountain climber in the Philippines. One time, my group went on a night hike to a mountain in central Luzon. Since we had a few beginners with us, we opted for the easier trail to the North Peak. At around 4 a.m., we packed up camp and started our descent. About an hour in, we noticed something strange. We kept passing the same fallen tree and the same boulder. The trail was clear, and most of us had hiked this mountain before, but for some reason, we kept going in circles. One of the more superstitious hikers suggested we all stand in a circle, say a prayer, and offer some food as an offering to the spirits. As soon as we did, we were able to finish our descent without further issue. I've got a lot of other creepy mountain stories if you're interested. Edit more stories. This happened around 2015 when I went on a day hike at Mount Gibi, in the southern part of Luzon. The previous week, I had hiked the same trail with a friend. It's a relatively easy and straightforward trail, so we didn't bother hiring a guide. Fast forward to the present day, I decided to do a night trek with 5 colleagues, and since I was the one familiar with the trail, I led the group. About an hour into the hike, we heard a strange sound. PSSSD, PSSSD, PSSSD. At first, we thought it might be one of the locals since some parts of the trail lead to small houses, but it stopped quickly, so we didn't think much of it. We continued and reached a narrow part of the trail with shallow cliffs on either side. I was focused on the path ahead, but I didn't realize my colleagues were lagging behind. One of them finally said, "Hey, shine your flashlight ahead." I paused and waited for them to catch up. When we reached camp, I asked my friend why he wanted me to shine the light in front of me. He whispered, "You were walking so fast, I didn't think you saw the child standing right in front of you." One time, my two friends and I were on our way home from the summit of Mount B in southern Luzon when a kid approached us, asking if we needed a guide for just 5 pesos. He was wearing a blue checkered shirt and white pants, and he looked very well groomed. His clothes were perfectly neat, and his hair wasn't messy at all. We knew the trail by heart, so we initially declined. But eventually, we gave in, figuring the kid would just follow us anyway. We started walking, and he suddenly stopped following us. I called out to him, but he didn't respond. He just stood there, staring at us. My friends were visibly scared, so I jokingly said, "Okay, stay there if you want, but you're not getting your 5 pesos, and we left. When I told other mountaineers about it later, they said the kid was probably the child of one of the guides. There's a popular urban legend about Mount C, also known as the Devil's Mountain. The story goes that a couple hiked Mount C at midnight, got lost after taking the wrong trail, and kept going even though a storm was rolling in and visibility was 0. They reached a fork in the trail where they took a left turn when they should have gone right. They never made it to the campsite, and locals say they've never been found. This story is connected to the previous one and also takes place on Mount C. A group of hikers and their guide went on a seldom used trail. Along the way, they passed a small village where the elders warned them to continue their hike but leave the only girl in their group behind. The group politely declined and carried on. Halfway through the trail, the guide informed them that he could only go as far as the first half of the hike. The group paid him, and they continued. Eventually, they reached a fork in the trail and debated which path to take. Just then, a couple appeared and told them to take the left trail. Despite it getting darker and rain starting to fall, the group decided to follow the couple. Suddenly, all their flashlights went out at once. But they continued to follow the couple in the dark. When the rain stopped and the flashlights turned back on, the couple was gone. One of the hikers slipped and nearly fell off a ravine. Like most people, not a ranger, but back in the early 90s, my brothers and I were staying with my cousin and her husband, Scott, who worked as a DNR officer. It was opening day of deer bow season in northern Michigan. I was about a mile from the nearest road or trail when I stumbled upon an area that looked like it had been used for camping recently. There was this strange outdoor kitchen set up which puzzled me. As a naive 16 or 17-year-old, I didn't think much of it at the time. I assumed the campers had packed up because hunting season had started, so I just moved on. That evening, I told everyone about the odd spot I'd found. When I mentioned it, Scott became very serious and asked me to describe the location in detail. After I did, he warned me not to go back there and said I was lucky no one was around. He explained that some locals use places like that to cook meth, intentionally setting up in remote spots to avoid blowing up their houses and to stay off the radar. Scott reported the location to the authorities, and a couple of days later, they raided it. Apparently, the guys who were using that spot had set up a bunch of expensive trail cams around the area. When the cops went through the footage, they found out I had just missed them by a few hours. These guys were heavily armed, while all I had was a bow and a knife. At first, it seemed like they had planned things pretty carefully, but it turns out they weren't as clever as they thought. Scott later shared more details with us. Apparently, They hadn't wiped the images off the cameras before they left. The pictures, though blurry and low-res, showed them cooking meth, carrying illegal firearms, and riding customized ATVs that were well known in the area. They ended up getting caught and sentenced to 20 years in prison. I'm a park ranger at a large park just outside a metro area. It's about 5,000 acres with a 1,500 acre lake. The park gets a lot of visitors, but there are some areas that are off the beaten path where it's quiet and less traveled. One day, I ended up stumbling across something really disturbing. I had been following a group of crows, thinking they were just acting like they usually do, when I came across an area with signs of animal sacrifice. It was eerie, something you don't expect to find out in the woods. While we usually don't have to worry much about the animals, it's the people we share this land with that can be far more unsettling. I once heard a story about a fish and game officer in Montana. She came across some guys who were up to no good, doing who knows what they shouldn't have been doing. They ended up stripping her down and tying her to a tree, leaving her there for a couple of days before she was found. No arrests were made in the end. I heard this tale from my dad, who spent 18 years as a smoke jumper and a total of 36 years with the Forest Service, where everyone was a federal employee. I'm not a ranger, but I have a story about the woods behind my house that still sticks with me. I've only ever lived in one place my entire life, up on a mountain in rural Alabama. I'm talking really rural. Around our house, you could walk a few miles in any direction and not find a single sign of civilization except for the road that led to our place. Just trees, leaves, and pine straw. Basically, a 3-mile radius of private woods. One night, when I was around 15 or 16, I had a girl over at my place who I was really trying to impress. So, I thought it'd be cool to take her to my favorite spot in the woods. In hindsight, it was probably a terrible idea, but this spot was my secret weapon. It was romantic. There were fireflies, the sound of small stream, the whole works. She was a little hesitant at first, but eventually agreed, eager for the adventure. We started down the path I cleared out. I had a lantern with me since I couldn't find my flashlight, so I couldn't really see too far ahead, but enough to follow the path. The walk was about 10 or 15 minutes, and halfway through, I started hearing this odd buzzing sound in the distance. It wasn't loud enough to drown out our conversation, but it was there whenever we stopped talking. I didn't think much of it at first, just the usual nighttime sounds of the woods, especially with it being spring. But as we kept walking, the buzzing got louder. Eventually, she asked me if I heard it too, and when I confirmed it, she immediately wanted to turn back. I agreed just to make her feel comfortable, but as we started heading back, the sound only grew louder. By the time we were almost out of the woods, it was clear what the noise was. Someone was playing harmonica, and it had been getting closer and closer to us the entire time. We ended up running full speed through the woods, across the yard, and straight into the house. We rushed to one of the windows facing the yard, flipped on the light, and cracked open the windowsill to listen. The sound of the harmonica was still out there, drifting by. We listened as it passed the house and faded away into the pines. It was one of the most surreal, terrifying experiences of my life. But, oddly, it's also one of my most cherished memories. That girl, the one I wanted to impress, ended up being the one that got away. This isn't my story, but it's one my dad, who was a ranger, told me. He and another ranger were out in the forest one night, camping halfway to their destination. Everything seemed fine at first, but as night fell, they started hearing footsteps, lots of them, circling their tent. Then they heard a chilling chorus of voices, at least 20 people screaming, "Get out!" Obviously, they didn't waste any time. They grabbed their gear, got out of there, and radioed it in. The next morning, a team of cops went out to investigate. When they arrived at the campsite, they made a disturbing discovery. 4 skinned animals were pinned to trees around the area, as if some sort of ritual had taken place. Needless to say, it left them all shaken. When I went backpacking at Philmont, every crew was assigned a ranger for the first couple of days to make sure we had the skills and knowledge to safely make it to our destinations. After those first days, the ranger would leave the crew to head to the nearest staff camp or pickup point. Our ranger told us about one of his experiences after he'd left a crew. He was following a game trail, which is usually an easy path through the woods, when out of nowhere, a mountain lion appeared behind him. The lion walked right up to him and then did something unexpected. It rubbed against his legs like a house cat. Apparently, when a mountain lion does that, your body just reacts involuntarily. You defecate and urinate yourself, hoping to God that the lion is just playing around. Thankfully for our ranger, the lion was indeed just messing with him, and he was able to make it safely back to camp without incident. If you made it to the end of the video, thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share, and we will see you in the next video.